This podcast is on design considerations that affect experimental research in social science research. One of the important design considerations in designing experiments is how we recruit our subjects. Often experiments take place on college campuses. But are college students representative of the entire population? Probably not. If we consider college students' typical demographic makeup, socioeconomic status, education levels, and so forth, they might not be reflective of the general population. Thus, can we really apply the results of these experiments to the general population? There are different ways to address this issue. First of all, we might try field experiments or online survey experiments to address the recruitment problem. This could open up our sample somewhat so that we're not just simply recruiting from one part of the population. A second consideration is to think about random assignment and what random assignment can do to help us make valid conclusions. Remember that random assignment allows us to control for many confounding factors. Since we do know that demographic and socioeconomic factors could affect results, we have to think about random assignment. If the control group is composed of similar people and the experimental group is composed of similar people, then this may indeed impact the results. Random assignment can help us avoid the problem because subjects are randomly assigned to groups, and thus groups are less likely to be composed of one type of subject. But again, this goes back to the problem of if we are recruiting only from college students, that's one type of subject. Let's try to think of an example where through random assignment and controlling for confounding factors, we may have a bit of an issue in regard to recruitment. So let's imagine that we're conducting an experiment on support for COVID-19 mitigation policies. If the control group only included liberals and the experimental group only included conservatives, the control group would naturally be more likely to show support for mitigation policies than the experimental group. So the differences in the groups would have nothing to do with the treatment that we apply, but rather ideology. Ideology would drive the results, not the treatment. Thus, that is a recruitment problem in terms of an example. So what can we do? Well, we can mimic real-world conditions. We likely will have to ask subjects to act as if they're making decisions in the real world. So this might help us to make the experiment be more realistic and thus give us valid conclusions. The more realistic we make the environment, the more independent variables we have to add to the analysis that you have to control for. So let's give an example. Let's imagine that we're conducting an experiment on support for state governors' COVID-19 mitigation policies. We tell subjects they live in a hypothetical state and describe the type of mitigation policies in the state. But a key point here is, how much information should we give our subjects about the hypothetical governor in that state? The more information you tell about that governor, the more factors they take into consideration when deciding if they support a governor's policies. We also need to consider measuring the treatment of the independent and the dependent variable. So how will we measure variations in the treatment? We have to keep in mind that part of the allure of experimental research is that we control the treatment. So for example, we can ask subjects to read different prompts. So in terms of measuring the treatment and how we measure variations in the dependent variable, we can ask subjects questions like on a survey. Now, all the issues that are involved with writing survey questions apply in experiments as well. So we want to make sure we write the questions in a way that we are measuring what we want to be measuring. In other words, that we have valid questions. If we write a poorly worded question, then we cannot measure variations in the dependent variable. We can use those two designs that we went over in the previous podcast. We can use the post-test only, And we can use the pre-test and post-test. Remember, the post-test only design allows us, if we do not know if there were differences in the dependent variable between the control and experimental groups prior to the treatment. So we're allowed not to know that. In the second design, did the pre-test affect the results of the post-test? So we need to know the pre-test level of the dependent variable and the post-test level of the dependent variable. That's the basic difference between the two designs. We also should consider ethical issues. In experiments, we're manipulating subjects. Depending upon the type of manipulation, that can have real-world implications. In other words, is it ethical to have an effect on real-world political outcomes? So we could experiment on the effect of campaign ads during election campaigns and see how they affect election outcomes. Well, that's a bit of manipulation of a real-world activity, an election campaign. We can experiment on the effect of the Get Out the Vote drive campaigns to increase voter turnout on voter turnout itself. We could do an experiment on human rights observation on respect for human rights. All of those things will have an impact on how subjects view the political world. And there are ethical considerations there, as you can see. Before conducting an experiment for part of your studies at Boise State, you'll need to make sure you speak to your instructor to ensure you're following the proper protocols when conducting the experiment. And you'll need to go through something called an institutional review board, which makes as its main feature, its mission, that human subjects are done no harm, or as little harm as possible, by research. So you need IRB approval if you're going to be conducting research under the auspices of Boise State University. Another type of issue in the ethical realm is called informed consent. So prior to the experiment, subjects read and sign what's called an informed consent form. And the researcher should keep this form for their records. Subjects should be told what the experiment is about, who is conducting the experiment, and what the purpose of the experiment is, with some small exceptions. Students should be told that they can stop, and not students, subjects should be told they can stop the experiment at any point. And subjects should be told as well that the answers they provide will be treated in the strictest confidence and all the results will be anonymous. That's part of the informed consent procedure. More generally speaking, you'll need funds in order to conduct these research efforts. You'll need to work with an organization of some sort to identify internal or external funding sources. And you should have a solid understanding of how your experiment will help you reach your research goals. That'll allow you to make a more compelling case to get funding for your research. Before conducting the experiment, you'll want to pre-test. You want to gather a small group of people together, and you'll want them to go through the experiment. You'll ask them after the experiment to paraphrase what the experimental conditions are and what their choices are during the experiment. You'll also ask them to make sure that they understand whatever questions are being asked and whatever answers are being given. And they could potentially provide an answer that is different from the one you anticipated. Is that a problem or not? If you do not pre-test the experiment and there's a design flaw in the experiment, then you cannot collect useful data and you will have wasted time, money, and effort. So pre-testing is important. In the next podcast, we will discuss natural experiments.